The rope snapped taut around Beulah Grimtusk's wrists just as the town bell began to ring, and Ezekiel Mercer dropped his hammer in the dirt of Drakken's market square and started running before he even understood why. Orc renegade! The magistrate's man was shouting, a wiry fellow named Corbin Ash with a crossbow already leveled. By order of Lord Halloran Vane, this creature is to be bound and held for the border tribunal. Beulah did not struggle the way they expected. She stood tall in the center of the square, her fitted warrior's leathers dark with road dust, her tusks catching the noon light, and she let the rope bite into her wrists without so much as a flinch, though her golden eyes tracked every man who circled her like wolves testing a bear too big to kill outright. Ezekiel had shot her horse not 3 days before, had felt the strange, dangerous thrill of her attention settle on him like a hand on the back of his neck. And now, he watched 4 men with spears try to drag her toward the stockade cart, and felt something in his chest crack open with a fury he did not recognize as his own. "She has done nothing," he said, and his voice came out louder than he intended, loud enough that half the square turned to look at the farrier instead of the orc. "She rode in peaceful, paid honest coin. I shot her mare myself." Corbin Ash sneered at him. "Mind your anvil, Mercer. This is Lord Vane's business, not a blacksmith's." "Farrier," Ezekiel said, because it was the only thing he could think to correct, and it made no difference at all, because 2 of the spearmen were already shoving Beulah toward the cart, and she let out a low, rolling growl in a language Ezekiel did not understand, 3 sharp syllables that sounded like a curse and a promise all at once, and something about the sound of it went through him like a struck bell. He did not remember deciding to move. He remembered his shoulder finding the gap between 2 spearmen, remembered his hand closing on the cart's tailgate before it could shut, remembered Corbin Ash's crossbow swinging toward his own chest, and he remembered, most of all, the way Beulah Grimtusk's eyes found his in that moment of chaos and did not look away, as if she were memorizing his face in case it was the last free thing she ever saw. "Stand down, farrier," Corbin barked, "or you ride in the cart with her." Ezekiel Mercer, who had spent 31 years being the quiet man at the edge of every room, who had never once in his life raised his voice to a magistrate's man, looked at the crossbow pointed at his heart and found that his hands were not shaking. "Then I will ride with her," he said. That was how it began, on a hot, dusty afternoon in the market square of Drakkenton, with a rope and a crossbow and a farrier who had shot her horse and could not, for reasons he did not yet understand, let them take her away. He had first seen her 6 days earlier, riding in from the eastern pass with her mare limping on a cracked shoe, and the whole town had gone quiet and watchful the way border towns did when an orc came through alone. Drakkenton sat on the last scrap of human land before the wild hills belonged to nobody and everybody, close enough to the Grimtusk clan's old territory that the war stories were still fresh in every mouth, though the war itself had ended a generation back. Ezekiel kept his forge at the edge of town, past the chapel and the feed store, because that was where the cavalry liked their farrier to be, close to the stable yards where Lord Vane's mounted men came and went. He had learned young that a man who worked with his hands and said little was a man people trusted enough to forget, and forgetting was safer than being noticed, especially for a man raised by a drunk father and buried mother who had left him nothing but an anvil and a debt. Beulah Grimtusk had walked her limping mare straight up to that forge without asking anyone's leave, and when Ezekiel had looked up from the fire, he had nearly burned his own hand on the tongs. She was tall, taller than most men, with shoulders built for swinging an axe and a waist his hands could have spanned, and she wore fitted leather armor laced tight up the sides, dark green-brown against skin the color of river clay, her black hair braided back from a face all sharp planes and fierce cheekbones, tusks curving up pale from her lower jaw. She was, without question, the most beautiful thing Ezekiel Mercer had ever seen, and he had been too startled to say so, which was probably for the best, because when she spoke her common tongue was rough and clipped and entirely unbothered by his staring. "My horse throws her shoe," she said. "You fix." "I can," he had managed. "Might take an hour." She had studied him then the way a hunter studies a strange track in the mud, and something in her gaze had sharpened with interest rather than contempt, which surprised him more than anything else that day. "You do not run," she observed. "Other humans run." "I need the coin," he had said honestly, and something like a laugh had cracked through her stern mouth, quick and startling, gone before he could be sure he had seen it. She had sat on the fence rail while he worked, watching his hands with an attention that made his neck hot, and partway through the shoeing she had begun to hum, low in her chest, a sound with no melody he recognized, words under her breath in a language thick with consonants he could not place. When he asked what she sang, she had only shaken her head and said, "Clan song." "Not for humans," in a tone that was not quite unkind, only certain, the way stone is certain. He had thought about that voice for 3 days after she rode away toward the hill country, thought about the shape of the words he could not understand, and he had told himself it was foolishness. A farrier mooning over an orc warrior who would never look twice at a man who smelled of horse sweat and coal smoke. And then she had ridden back into Dracketon on the 7th day, not for her horse this time, but because, as she told him later, she liked the sound of his hammer and wanted to hear it again. And that was the day Lord Vane's men had come for her in the square. Now, hours after the standoff at the cart, Ezekiel sat in the dim single cell of the Dracketon stockade, a low stone building behind the magistrate's hall, with Beulah chained to the opposite wall, her wrists raw from the rope and now bound again in iron, and he understood with a cold, sinking certainty that his courage in the square had bought him very little beyond a matching cell. "You are a fool," Beulah said into the dark, not looking at him. "You did not have to put your body in that cart." "Didn't feel like a choice," Ezekiel said. She turned her head then, gold eyes catching what little light came through the barred window. "Why?" He thought about lying, about saying something noble and vague, and found he did not have the stomach for it. "Because they were going to hurt you, and I could not stand there and let it happen. That is the whole truth of it. I do not have a clever answer." Beulah was quiet a long moment, and then, so softly he almost missed it, she said something in her clan tongue, 3 low words, and though he did not know their meaning, he felt the weight of them settle over him like a hand laid flat against his chest. "What does that mean?" he asked. "Not yet," she said, and closed her eyes and did not answer again that night. The magistrate's hall stood on a low rise above the market square, its stone walls newer and cleaner than anything else in Dracketon, paid for, the townsfolk said, by taxes squeezed from every farm and forge for 20 miles. Lord Halloran Vane held court there twice a month, and it was Vane himself who came to the stockade the next morning, a broad man in a fine wool coat with a magistrate's chain of office and a face like a closed door. "The Grimtusk woman is wanted for raiding my grain stores 3 seasons past," Vane said without preamble, standing outside the bars with his hands clasped behind him. "There is a bounty on her from 3 border lords. I intend to collect it, and I intend to make an example of any man foolish enough to shield an orc renegade in my own market square. She has not raided anything since she rode into this town," Ezekiel said. "I have shot her horse twice. I know when a woman is running with stolen grain and when she is not." Vane's eyes flicked to him with mild, contemptuous curiosity, the way a man looks at a dog that has learned an unexpected trick. "The farrier speaks. Careful, Mercer. Sympathy for orcs is a rope around a man's own neck in this town, and I would hate to see a serviceable craftsman hang beside a beast." "Is not a beast," Ezekiel said, and heard Beulah shift behind him, though she said nothing. "She is Grimtusk," Vane said, as though that settled it, and turned to go. "The tribunal rides through in 4 days' time. Until then she stays chained, and you, Mercer, will consider very carefully whether your forge is worth more to you than your foolish gallantry." He left, boots ringing on the stone floor outside, and the silence after him felt thick enough to choke on. "He lies about the grain," Beulah said finally. "It was Vane's own steward who stole from his stores and blamed my clan to cover his theft. My clan chief sent me to find proof. That is why I was near this town. Not for raiding. For truth. Do you have the proof?" I had it, she said, and her jaw tightened. A ledger taken from the steward's own saddlebag. It is hidden now in the hills where they will not think to look. If I do not return with it, my clan will believe I failed or died, and Vane's lie stands forever. Ezekiel sat with that for a while, turning it over, and found the shape of a plan beginning to form, rough and dangerous, and entirely unlike anything he had ever attempted in his careful, quiet life. "Then we get you out," he said, "and we get that ledger." Beulah looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her golden eyes. "Why would you do this, farrier? This is not your fight. Your people call me renegade. Your lord will burn your forge for less than what you have already done. Because you are innocent of the thing they want to hang you for," he said simply. "And because nobody else in this whole town is going to stand up and say so, I might as well be the one fool who does." She studied him a long while more, and then, unexpectedly, she smiled, small and sharp and real. "You are a strange human, Ezekiel Mercer." It was the first time she had said his full name, and he found he liked the sound of it far too much for a man in a jail cell, awaiting a magistrate's tribunal. The escape, when it came, was neither clean nor clever, but it worked because Ezekiel knew the stockade's iron and Beulah knew her own strength, and between the two of them, they undid what 4 armed men had thought unbreakable. It happened on the 3rd night, with the tribunal riders due the next morning. Ezekiel had spent 2 days quietly loosening the hinge pins on the cell's barred door with a nail he'd smuggled in his boot, working slow and silent, while the single guard dozed by the stove at the far end of the hall. And on the 3rd night, he finally worked the last pin free and eased the door open with barely a groan of iron. "Now," he whispered, and Beulah came awake instantly, no grogginess in her at all, the iron cuffs on her wrists already strained and cracked from 3 nights of quiet, patient pulling that Ezekiel had not even noticed until she snapped the last link with a soft, savage twist of her hands. They moved through the sleeping hall like shadows, past the dozing guard, out into a night thick with the smell of coming rain, and Beulah led them not toward the stable, where horses would be watched, but along the back wall of the magistrate's hall toward the low stone fence that marked the edge of town. They had nearly cleared it when a voice rang out behind them, sharp and furious. "Stop there!" It was Corbin Ash, crossbow already up, standing between them and the dark tree line beyond the fence, and for one frozen second Ezekiel thought it was over, thought he had traded his forge and his freedom for nothing at all. Then Beulah moved. She did not run for cover. She ran straight at Corbin, closing the distance before he could loose his bolt, and drove her shoulder into his chest with a force that sent him sprawling into the fence rail, the crossbow discharging harmlessly into the dark. She did not kill him, though Ezekiel saw plainly that she could have, snapped his neck with one twist of those powerful hands, and instead she simply pinned him to the ground with a knee on his chest and leaned close, her voice a low, furious growl. "Tell your lord this," she said. "The Grimtusk do not forget a lie, and we do not forget a kindness either." She released him, stood, and looked back at Ezekiel with something fierce and bright in her eyes. "Come, farrier, before the whole town wakes." They ran together into the dark toward the hills, Corbin Ash's cursing fading behind them, and Ezekiel Mercer, who had never in his life run toward danger instead of away from it, found that his heart was pounding not with fear but with something that felt, absurdly, like joy. They did not stop running until the gray hour before dawn, when the hills rose steep enough that the horses they had no choice but to steal from a farmer's paddock along the way needed to be walked rather than ridden, and Ezekiel's lungs burned with a stitch that made him grateful for the excuse to slow. Beulah moved beside him with the easy, rolling stride of someone built for these slopes, her breathing barely changed, and it was only when they finally paused beneath a stand of black pines that she seemed to notice how badly winded he was. "You are not made for running," she observed, not unkindly, handing him a waterskin taken from the farmer's tack shed. "I'm made for standing at an anvil," Ezekiel admitted, drinking gratefully. "This is new territory for me." "You do well for a man made for standing," she said, and there was warmth in it, enough that he looked up at her and found her watching him with an expression he could not quite name, something between amusement and appraisal and a heat that made his mouth go dry. They made a cold camp that first night, no fire, tucked into a hollow between two boulders where the wind could not find them easily. And it was there, wrapped in the single thin blanket Ezekiel had grabbed from the farmer's shed, shoulder to shoulder for warmth against the mountain chill, that she first spoke in her sleep. He noticed it slowly, the way you notice a sound that has been going on for some time before your mind catches up to it. A low murmur, words tumbling soft and quick, the same clipped consonants he remembered from that first day at the forge. He lay very still, careful not to wake her, and listened, and though he understood not a single word, he understood the tone of it perfectly well, fear and grief, and something that might have been a name repeated twice, low and broken, like a woman calling for someone lost. She woke with a start some time later, breath ragged, and found him watching her in the dark. "You talk in your sleep," he said gently, "in your clan tongue." Something flickered across her face, quick and guarded, gone almost before he saw it. "I did not know. You said something twice, like a name." She was quiet a long moment, staring out at the dark tree line. "My brother's name," she said finally. "He died in the border war when I was young. I do not speak of him, even to myself awake." She looked at him then, something raw and unguarded in her gaze. "But sleep does not ask permission." "I'm sorry," Ezekiel said, and meant it entirely. "Do not be sorry," she said, but her voice had gone soft, and she did not pull away when he shifted a fraction closer, sharing what little warmth the blanket held, and they slept the rest of that night with her back against his chest, her murmured words tapering off into quiet, and Ezekiel Mercer lay awake far longer than he needed to, memorizing the sound of a language he could not understand and wanting, with a fierceness that startled him, to learn every word of it. By the fourth day of hard travel through the hill country, moving always west and north toward the vague territory Beulah called the Ledger's hiding place, Ezekiel had begun, in small, clumsy ways, to try. "Teach me a word," he said one evening as they sat over the first fire they had dared to risk, far enough now from Draketin's reach that Beulah judged a small flame safe. She glanced at him sideways, one eyebrow raised. "Why?" "Because you speak it when you're afraid, and I want to understand you when you can't help but be honest," he said, and then, hearing how it sounded, added quickly, "That came out stranger than I meant it." But Beulah was not laughing at him. She was watching him with that same unreadable intensity, and after a moment she said, quiet and deliberate, "Ashkur," and touched her closed fist to her chest. "It means to hold, to keep safe. My clan says it of a warrior's shield or a mother's arms." "Ashkur," Ezekiel repeated, clumsy on his tongue, and she laughed, a real laugh this time, bright and surprised. "Terrible," she said. "Try again." He tried again and again, mangling it worse each time until she was laughing outright, and the sound of it, warm and unguarded around a small fire in the wild hills, felt like the finest thing he had ever earned. "You truly wish to learn," she said, once the laughter faded, studying him now with something softer. "I do," he said. "Every word you'll give me." "Why?" she asked again, but gentler this time, less a challenge and more a genuine question, and Ezekiel found he had no clever farrier's evasion left in him. "Because you matter to me," he said, "more than is sensible for a man who's known you 11 days. I want to understand every part of you, even the parts you keep locked up while you're awake." Beulah went very still, firelight moving across her sharp, beautiful face, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. Then she reached across the small space between them and laid her broad hand against his jaw, thumb tracing the line of his cheekbone with a gentleness that seemed almost at war with her strength. "No human has ever asked to learn my language," she said. "They ask me to speak theirs, always theirs." "I'm not most humans," Ezekiel said, voice rough. "No," she agreed softly, "you are not." She kissed him then, there beside the small fire in the wild hills, her mouth firm and certain against his, tasting of wood smoke and something wilder, and Ezekiel Mercer, who had spent his whole quiet life waiting at the edge of rooms for someone to notice him, felt for the first time in memory entirely, thoroughly chosen. He brought his hand up to cup the back of her neck, and she made a low sound against his mouth, half growl and half sigh, and when they finally parted she rested her forehead against his, breathing hard. "This is foolishness," she murmured, but her hands had not let go of him. "You are human, I am Grimtusk. Our peoples have hated each other since before you were born." "I don't much care what our peoples have done," Ezekiel said. "I care what you and I do." She laughed again, soft this time, and pulled him close against her, and they sat together by the fire long into the night, her murmuring stray words of her clan tongue and him repeating them back badly, both of them laughing, both of them entirely undone by the other, and neither one of them minding it in the least. They traveled 3 more days before reaching the hidden hollow where Beulah had buried the steward's ledger, a narrow crevice behind a waterfall in a valley she navigated by memory alone, and the finding of it should have been the easy part of their journey. It was not. They emerged from the crevice, ledger wrapped safe in oilcloth in Beulah's saddlebag, only to find 6 riders waiting in the valley below, Lord Vane's colors bright on their tabards, Corbin ash at their head with a face like a thundercloud and a fresh scar along his jaw where the fence rail had caught him. "There she is," Corbin called up, "and the traitor farrier with her. Lord Vane will pay double for the pair of you." Ezekiel's stomach dropped, but Beulah's hand found his arm, steady and sure. "We do not run this time," she said quietly. "There is high ground behind us. We use it." They scrambled up the rocky slope above the waterfall while the riders dismounted below, unable to bring horses up the narrow goat track, and it became, in the end, a fight fought with what the land gave them. Loose stones sent tumbling down the slope, a narrow choke point where only one man could climb at a time, Beulah's borrowed sword meeting the first man to reach the top with a speed and ferocity that sent him tumbling back down into his fellows. Ezekiel, who had never swung anything more dangerous than a smith's hammer in anger, found himself doing exactly that, catching a second climber's wrist and wrenching his blade loose before driving a shoulder into his chest and sending him sprawling after the first. It was Corbin Ash who nearly ended it, working his way up a side path Beulah had not accounted for, crossbow rising toward Ezekiel's back while his attention was fixed on the choke point below. It was Beulah who saw him first, who threw herself bodily across the narrow ledge, putting her own body between the bolt and Ezekiel's spine, taking the shot meant for him high in her shoulder. With a grunt of pain she bit down hard rather than voice. "Beulah!" Ezekiel spun, catching her before she could stagger off the ledge, horror clawing up his throat at the sight of the bolt buried in her flesh. "I am well," she gritted out, though her face had gone pale beneath the clay brown of her skin. "Finish this." He did not want to leave her, but Corbin was already reloading, and Ezekiel understood with sudden, cold clarity that the only way to keep her safe now was to end the threat himself. He scrambled down the side path before Corbin could finish, tackling him at the knees, and the crossbow went spinning off the ledge into the ravine below. They grappled on the narrow stone, Corbin's fist catching Ezekiel's jaw hard enough to see stars, but the farrier's hands were strong from years at the forge, and he pinned Corbin's arms with a grip that would not break. "Call them off," Ezekiel snarled, blood in his mouth, "or I put you off this ledge myself." Whether it was the look in his eyes or the simple math of a losing position, Corbin Ash called down to his remaining men to fall back, and the riders retreated to the valley floor, dragging their wounded, leaving Ezekiel and Beulah alone on the high rocks with the ledger safe and a crossbow bolt buried deep in her shoulder. He got the bolt out that night by firelight, her jaw clenched tight and her hand crushing his free one hard enough to bruise while he worked, and when it was done and the wound bound tight with strips torn from his own shirt, she looked at him with an expression he had not seen from her before, something raw and unguarded, and entirely without the wariness she usually carried like armor. "You could have run," she said. "When Corbin came for you, you could have left me on that ledge and saved yourself." "Never once occurred to me," Ezekiel said honestly, and meant it with his whole chest. "You are the strangest human," Beulah said again, softer this time, and there were tears standing unshed in her golden eyes, tears she seemed almost angry at herself for having. Nobody has ever thrown themselves between me and a blade. I am the one who does that. I am the shield. Maybe we take turns, Ezekiel said, and she laughed, wet and startled, and pulled him down against her good shoulder. And they slept that night tangled together against the cold, her murmured clan words drifting into his ear all through the dark hours, and he understood, without needing to be told, that something had shifted between them on that ledge. Some final wall come down for good. They stayed 3 days in that valley while her shoulder mended enough for hard travel, and it was there, in a hidden hollow far from any road, that Ezekiel Mercer and Beulah Grimtusk became something more than two people running from danger together. It happened on the second evening, when the fire had burned low and the air had turned soft with the particular quiet of a place that felt, for once, entirely safe. Beulah had been teaching him words again, patient despite her pain, and when he stumbled badly over a phrase she wanted him to repeat, she had reached out to correct the shape of his mouth with her thumb, and the touch had lingered, and neither of them had pulled away. "Say it again," she murmured, her voice gone low and rough. He said it again badly, and she laughed against his mouth as she kissed him, and this time neither of them stopped at a single kiss. Her hands found the collar of his shirt, careful of her injured shoulder but not gentle in her want, and he answered her with his own hands, finding the laces of her leathers, slow and reverent, asking without words if this was truly what she wanted. And her answer was to pull him down with her onto the folded blanket, murmuring his name now instead of her brother's, Ezekiel, Ezekiel, like she was testing the shape of it the way he had tested her clan words. "Tell me if I hurt you," he said against her throat, mindful of her wound, and she huffed a breathless laugh. "You could not hurt me if you tried, farrier," she said, and then, softer, "but I thank you for asking." What passed between them that night in the fire-lit hollow was neither rushed nor careless. It was slow and searching and full of a tenderness that surprised them both. Her strength gentled entirely for him, his hesitance burned away by her open, unhidden want. And when it was over they lay tangled together beneath the stars with her head on his chest and his fingers tracing idle patterns along her uninjured arm. And she murmured something low and warm against his skin that he did not understand, and did not ask her to translate, content simply to feel the weight of it. "Whatever it meant, I want to know all of it," he said eventually into the quiet, "not just the sleep words, all your language, all of you." "Then I will teach you," she said, "all of it. Every word my clan has if you have the patience for it." "I have nothing but patience," Ezekiel said. "It's the one thing a farrier has plenty of. You can't rush a horseshoe or a woman like you. I've learned that much already." She laughed again, delighted, and kissed him once more, slow and certain, and outside their small hollow the mountain wind moved through the pines like something singing, and Ezekiel Mercer thought that he had never, in all his careful, quiet life, felt less alone. They resumed their journey once her shoulder had knitted enough to bear the strain of riding, angling now not back toward Draketon, but toward the Grimtusk clan's territory itself, higher into the hills where the pines grew thick and dark, and the air smelled of snow, even though the season had not yet turned. Beulah's plan was simple in its shape, if not its execution. Reach her clan chief, deliver the ledger proving Lord Vane's steward had stolen the grain and framed the Grimtusk for the theft, and let clan justice and border politics do what neither of them could accomplish alone. It would clear her name formally, and perhaps, if the chief was willing to press the matter with the border lords, clear the bounty from her head entirely. Along the way, in the slow hours of riding and the quiet hours of camp, Ezekiel kept his promise. He learned. Beulah taught him words for fire and water and horse, taught him the clan's rough grammar with its clipped endings and rolling consonants, taught him curses that made her laugh when he used them wrong, and endearments she blushed, in her own fierce way, to explain when he asked their meaning too directly. "Ashsoon," she said one night, teaching him by firelight while she sharpened her sword with slow, practiced strokes. "It means beloved, chosen above all others. My clan uses it rarely, only for a bonded mate." Ezekiel turned the word over in his mouth, careful with it. "Ashsun," he said and looked at her. "Is that what you'd call me if you were speaking your tongue and not mine?" Beulah's whetstone stilled against the blade. She looked at him for a long moment, something vulnerable moving behind her fierce eyes, and then quietly she said, "Yes." It was not a grand declaration, not shouted from any rooftop, but it settled into Ezekiel's chest with more weight than any speech could have carried, and he crossed the small distance between them and kissed her, slow and sure, and she made that low sound again, the one that was half growl and half something far softer, and pulled him close. They reached the outer edge of Grimtusk territory on the 9th day since fleeing Draketin, a wide sweep of hill country marked by carved stone waymarkers older than any human road Ezekiel had ever traveled. And it was there that the danger they had both, perhaps, allowed themselves to forget in the warmth of the journey came roaring back with terrible speed. They had made camp in a shallow dell near a stream, close enough to clan lands that Beulah judged them safe for one more night before reaching the war camp itself the following day. And it was there, in the gray hour before true dawn, that Lord Vane's remaining riders finally caught them. There were more of them this time, 8 in all, and Vane himself rode among them, his fine wool coat replaced with a hard leather cuirass better suited to hunting than governing, his face set in the grim satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally cornered what he was owed. "You have led us a long chase, Grimtusk," Vane called out, as his men fanned wide around the dell, cutting off any easy retreat. "But the hills end here, and so does your farrier's foolish gallantry." Ezekiel was on his feet instantly, placing himself between Vane's riders and Beulah before he had even fully thought it through, though he carried nothing but a belt knife against 8 armed men. Beulah caught his arm, not to pull him back but to stand beside him rather than behind, her sword already drawn. "You will not take him," she said, voice ringing clear across the dell. "You will not take either of us." "I do not need the farrier," Vane said, almost bored. "Only you and the ledger my thieving steward's carelessness left in your keeping. Hand it over and I might let the man go free." "Might," Ezekiel said, "is not a word I trust from you, Lord Vane." Vane's mouth thinned. "Wise farrier, you are wiser than I gave you credit for. It changes nothing." He raised a gloved hand, a signal to close in, and Ezekiel's heart dropped because 8 armed riders against 2 exhausted travelers was not a fight. It was an execution waiting for a command. That was when the horn sounded from the ridgeline above. Beulah's head snapped up and something fierce and triumphant broke across her face. "Grimtusk," she breathed. "They found us. They have been tracking Vane's riders since the border, waiting for the moment to strike." The ridge above the dell filled suddenly with orc riders, a dozen at least, war axes and spears catching the first gray light of dawn, and at their head rode a broad, gray-haired orc woman with a chief's braided mantle, and a face that shared enough of Beulah's fierce bone structure that Ezekiel understood immediately who she must be. "Mother," Beulah said, and there was relief and steel both in the single word. Vane's men broke and scattered before the Grimtusk riders had even fully closed the distance, the numbers and the terror of orc war cries doing what Vane's authority could not. And within minutes, it was Lord Halloran Vane himself standing alone in the dell, his fine coat and hard cuirass doing nothing to disguise the naked fear on his face as Beulah's mother reined her mount to a stop directly before him, spear leveled at his throat. "You are the lord who has hunted my daughter across 3 provinces on a lie," the chief said, her common tongue thick but perfectly clear. "Give me one reason I should not let my riders finish what your steward's greed began." "The ledger," Ezekiel said quickly, before violence could take the moment from them entirely. He pulled the oilcloth bundle from Beulah's saddlebag and held it up. "This proves the theft was your own steward's doing, not the Grimtusk. Take it to whatever tribunal will hear it. Let the truth stand instead of blood." The chief studied him for a long moment, gold eyes so like her daughter's assessing him with unhurried thoroughness. And who are you, human, to speak for my daughter's justice? Ezekiel Mercer, he said, farrier of Draketon, I love your daughter, and I would rather see her cleared by truth than avenged by a fight neither of us wants. A murmur ran through the gathered riders at that, and Beulah's mother's gaze flicked between the two of them, taking in, perhaps for the first time, the way her daughter stood close beside this human, unafraid, unguarded, entirely unlike the wary warrior she had raised. "Is this true, Beulah?" the chief asked. "This human has your heart." Beulah lifted her chin, and though Ezekiel saw the flicker of nerves cross her face, her voice did not waver. "It is true, mother. He came into a jail cell for me. He crossed the hills for me. He took a blade meant for another man to keep me from grieving him. I have chosen him." The chief was silent a long moment, and Lord Vane, still pinned beneath her spear, made the mistake of finding his tongue at the worst possible moment. "This is madness," he spat. "An orc and a human bonded. It is an offense against every law of both our peoples." The chief's spear point pressed a fraction closer to his throat, silencing him instantly. "The laws of your people are not the laws of mine, Lord Vane, and it is not your place to speak of offense while your own hands are stained with a lie that has hunted my daughter for 3 seasons. She turned back to Beulah and Ezekiel, and something in her stern face softened, just slightly. "The Grimtusk do not choose lightly, and we do not choose foolishly. If my daughter has chosen this man, then he has earned it, by whatever measure the spirits judge such things. That is enough for me." She took the ledger from Ezekiel's hand, tucking it into her own saddlebag with the finality of a woman who intended to see justice done properly, and then turned her attention back to Lord Vane, who had gone pale and silent beneath her spear. "You will ride back to your border lords," she said, "and you will carry this ledger with you, and you will see the truth of your steward's theft made known before every tribunal that has heard your lies about my clan. If you do not, the next riders who find you will not be so patient as I have been this morning. Do you understand me, Lord Vane?" Vane, to his credit or his cowardice, understood perfectly, and within the hour he and his remaining men rode east under Grimtusk escort, the ledger secure. His authority over Beulah's fate ended as thoroughly as if it had never existed at all. That left Ezekiel and Beulah standing in the dell in the full light of morning, surrounded by Grimtusk riders who watched the human farrier with open curiosity, some wary, some amused, none of them hostile in the way he had braced himself for, and Beulah's mother dismounted and crossed to stand before them both, studying Ezekiel with an intensity that made him want very much to stand up straight and prove himself worthy of it. "You learned our tongue," she said, not quite a question. "Some of it," Ezekiel admitted. "Beulah's been teaching me, poorly on my end. She has a great deal of patience." The chief's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "My daughter has never had patience for anything in her life except a fight worth having." She looked at Beulah then, something warm passing between mother and daughter that needed no translation. "Bring him to the war camp. Let the clan see this human who crossed the hills and stood in a jail cell for love of a Grimtusk warrior. It will make for good telling around the fires this winter." The Grimtusk war camp sat in a wide valley 2 days' ride further into the hills, a sprawl of hide tents and cook fires and picket lines for the clan's shaggy mountain horses, smoke rising in thin gray threads against a sky gone hard blue with the first real cold of the coming season. Ezekiel had braced himself for suspicion, for the wary stares Beulah had warned him he might receive as the first human many of these warriors had ever seen up close who was not an enemy on a battlefield. And there was some of that, curious eyes following him through the camp, low murmured conversations he could not fully follow despite his weeks of lessons. But there was also, to his surprise, a rough kind of welcome, earned not through any grand gesture but through the simple, steady fact of his presence beside Beulah, unafraid and unashamed, and through the story that ran ahead of them through the camp like wildfire. The human farrier who had ridden into a jail cell, who had thrown himself between a magistrate's man and a crossbow bolt, who had learned the clan tongue not to command it but to understand a woman's grief. That night around the great central fire of the war camp, with the whole clan gathered in a wide, loose circle and the cold stars burning bright overhead, Beulah's mother called for silence and told the story herself, in the clan tongue first and then, deliberately, in common tongue for Ezekiel's benefit, of her daughter's chase across the borderlands and the human who had chosen, again and again, to stand rather than run. "It is not a small thing," the chief said, "for a Grimtusk to choose a mate outside the clan. It has happened rarely and not always well. But I have watched this man these 2 days, and I have listened to my daughter's voice when she speaks of him, and I tell you now before the fire and before the ancestors, Ezekiel Mercer has earned his place at this fire, not as a stranger tolerated, but as kin claimed." There was a low rumble of approval through the gathered clan. Spears struck rhythmically against the ground in what Ezekiel would later learn was the Grimtusk way of voicing agreement, and Beulah, sitting close beside him with her hand tight in his, leaned in to murmur against his ear. "This is the closest thing my clan has to a blessing," she said. "You do not need to understand every word. You only need to know that they have accepted what I already knew the day I heard your hammer ring twice." "I understood enough," Ezekiel said, throat tight. "Ashsoon." Beulah's breath caught, and she turned to look at him with her golden eyes bright in the firelight, and though the whole clan was watching, she kissed him there before them all, slow and certain, and the spears struck the ground again, louder this time, and somewhere in the circle an old warrior began to sing a low, rolling song that Ezekiel recognized, with a jolt of joy, as the very melody Beulah had once told him was not for humans. He did not understand every word of it even now. But he understood at last and completely, the woman singing it beside him, and that, he thought, was the only translation that had ever truly mattered. They stayed in the war camp through the turning of the season, and Ezekiel found work there that suited him well enough. For a clan that rode as hard, and as often as the Grimtusk had never known a shortage of horses needing shoes, and his forge skills, rough as his hill camp setup was compared to his proper smithy in Draketon, earned him steady respect among warriors who valued a well-shod horse nearly as much as they valued a well-honed blade. He built a small forge at the edge of camp with materials traded from a passing merchant caravan, and within a month half the clan's horses wore shoes of his making, and children who had never seen a human up close before came to watch him work with the same wide-eyed fascination he had once felt watching Beulah ride into Draketon. But the ledger's justice, once set in motion, did not resolve itself quietly, and word came in early winter, carried by a Grimtusk rider who had followed the matter through 3 border towns, that Lord Halloran Vane's steward had confessed under the weight of the evidence and the pressure of a tribunal no longer willing to overlook a lord's convenient lies, and that Vane himself, stripped of a good portion of his authority and his reputation both, had been forced by the Border Council to issue a formal clearing of the Grimtusk name, and more particularly of Beulah Grimtusk herself, whose bounty was struck from every ledger in the region. She received the news standing outside Ezekiel's small forge, the messenger's words still hanging in the cold air, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, simply stood very still with her jaw tight and her eyes bright, and Ezekiel set down his tongs and crossed to her without needing to be asked. "It's done," he said softly. "You're free, truly free, not just running free. Free to walk into any town on this border and no one will raise a hand against you." "I did not think it would feel like this," Beulah admitted, voice rough. "I have been running or hiding or fighting for so long, I forgot what it might feel like to simply be believed." "Believe it," Ezekiel said, pulling her close, and she let him, pressing her face against his shoulder in a rare, unguarded moment. And around them the war camp went on with its ordinary business, cook fires and horses and children laughing somewhere near the picket line, entirely unbothered by the sight of a fierce Grimtusk warrior weeping quietly with relief in a human farrier's arms. It was not, however, the end of every danger they faced together, And the final and most frightening trial of their bond came not from Lord Vane or the border tribunal, but from something far smaller and far more personal. The judgment of the clan itself, when it came time to formalize what had, until then, existed only as an understanding between two people who loved each other. Grimtusk custom held that a warrior who chose a mate outside the clan must prove that bond before the clan elders in a rite called the Ashkur Vel, the holding trial, a test meant to demonstrate that the outsider could be trusted with a Grimtusk warrior's life as surely as any clan-born spouse. Beulah had explained it to Ezekiel with obvious reluctance, clearly wishing the custom did not exist at all. "It is old and it is dangerous and I do not like it," she said, pacing outside their shared tent in the gray light of an early winter morning. "It has killed outsiders before. I will not have you risk yourself for a tradition I think is foolish." "What does it require?" Ezekiel asked. "A trial of trust," she said. "The outsider is bound and left in the path of a loosed war horse, and the Grimtusk mate must stop the horse and free the outsider before it tramples him, using only what skill and speed they carry, no weapon, no magic. It proves the mate's devotion is strong enough to protect against real danger, not just spoken of prettily around a fire." "Then let me stand it," Ezekiel said. "If it is what your clan requires to see us as truly bonded, I would rather face the horse than spend our whole life with half your people wondering if I truly belong." Beulah argued against it fiercely for 2 full days, and it was only when the clan elders themselves made clear that, without the trial, certain rights and protections of full clan kinship would remain forever closed to Ezekiel, that she relented, and even then only because Ezekiel refused, gently but immovably, to let her face that judgment alone on his behalf. The trial was held on a clear, cold morning at the edge of the war camp, with the whole clan gathered to watch, and Ezekiel stood at the center of a wide open field, wrists bound loosely with braided leather cord, while at the far end of the field a war horse, a huge dun stallion trained for the charge, waited with a handler ready to loose it at the elder's signal. Beulah stood off to one side, sword sheathed as the ritual demanded, her whole body coiled tight with a tension Ezekiel had never seen in her before, not even in the fight on the ledge above the waterfall. "When the horn sounds," she told him quietly one last time, "do not move to help me. Trust me to reach you." That is the whole of the trial. Trust both ways. "I trust you," Ezekiel said, and meant it entirely, and the elder raised the horn to her lips and blew a single sharp note, and the handler released the stallion. The horse thundered down the field with a speed that made Ezekiel's heart seize despite every ounce of trust he carried, hooves throwing up clods of frozen earth, and he stood his ground exactly as instructed, bound and still, watching the massive animal close the distance with terrifying speed. Beulah moved like nothing he had ever seen, a blur of motion across the field, faster than he would have believed a person could run, and she reached him with only a handful of strides left before the stallion's charge would have carried it straight over him. She did not simply pull him aside. She threw herself between him and the horse's path, catching the stallion's bridle with both hands in a grip of pure desperate strength, digging her heels into the frozen ground, and hauling the animal's head aside with a roar of effort that Ezekiel felt in his own chest. And the huge horse's charge broke, and swerved a bare arm's length from where he stood, closer to true danger than either of them had allowed themselves to imagine beforehand. The field went silent for one long, terrible heartbeat, and then erupted into a roar of approval, spears striking the ground in that same rhythmic clan applause, as Beulah, breathing hard and shaking with spent effort, released the stallion to its handler and turned to cut Ezekiel's bonds herself with her own belt knife, hands trembling now not with exertion but with something rower. "You did not flinch," she said, voice thick. "Even facing that, you did not flinch." "I trusted you," Ezekiel said simply, and pulled her into his arms despite the whole clan watching, and this time no elder objected, no custom demanded restraint, and the old chief herself stepped forward through the crowd to lay a hand on each of their shoulders. "The trial is past," she announced, loud enough for the whole gathered clan to hear. "Ezekiel Mercer stands proven. Let no one in this clan or beyond it question the bond between my daughter and this human ever again." It was, in the way of Grimtusk custom, as close to a wedding as either of them would ever need. And that night the whole camp celebrated with roasted meat, and clan songs sung loud around a bonfire built taller than any Ezekiel had yet seen. And Beulah, flushed with relief and pride and a fierce, open joy she no longer troubled herself to hide, pulled him away from the fire's edge sometime past midnight, into the quiet dark beyond the tents. "I am done with trials," she said, framing his face in both her hands. "I am done proving anything to anyone. I only want you, Ezekiel Mercer, for however many winters the spirits grant us." "You have me," he said. "You've had me since the day you hummed a song you wouldn't translate and rode off toward the hills." She laughed, low and warm, and kissed him beneath the bright cold stars, and this time there was no fear in it. No danger circling close enough to steal the moment. Only two people who had earned, through fire and blade and honest hard-won trust, the simple right to want each other in peace. Winter passed in the war camp with a rhythm Ezekiel found, to his own surprise, more satisfying than any season he had known in Draketin. His forge grew busier as word spread among neighboring clans of the human farrier, who shot a horse better than any traveling smith they had hired before. And he found himself, bit by bit, building not just a livelihood but a genuine place among people who had once been strangers to him, in every sense the word could carry. Beulah rode out on clan business as she always had, hunting and scouting and settling disputes along the border, with the same fierce competence that had first drawn Ezekiel's eye at his forge in Draketin. But she rode out now knowing there was someone waiting for her return who understood, in whispered fragments across their shared bedroll, the language her sleeping mind still turned to when old griefs surfaced in her dreams. He learned, over that long winter, most of what her clan tongue had to offer, not out of any grand design but simply because he wanted, more than he had ever wanted anything, to know every corner of her, waking and sleeping both. He learned the word for grief and the word for joy, the word for the particular ache of missing someone gone, and the word, at last, for the thing that had grown between them on that hillside above Draketin and never once wavered since. Spring came to the hill country with a suddenness that surprised him, snow melting off the high ridges in a rush that swelled the streams and turned the war camp's paths to mud. And it was on one of the first true warm evenings, with the whole valley smelling of thawed earth and new grass, that Beulah came to find him at his forge, still in her fitted warrior's leathers, though she had traded the travel-stained set from their journey for a newer pair the clan's leatherworkers had gifted her. Dark green-brown and lace-tight in the Grimtusk fashion, and told him, without preamble, exactly what she wanted their life to look like going forward. "I do not wish to stay only here in my mother's camp forever," she said, sitting on the fence rail exactly as she had that first day at his forge in Draketin, watching his hands work the bellows. "I love my clan. I will always love my clan, but I have seen how you look at the open road, farrier. I do not think a man who ran into danger for love of me is a man content to stay in one valley his whole life either." Ezekiel set down his tongs, considering her. "What are you proposing?" "A homestead," she said. "Near enough the border that we can trade in the towns, near enough my mother's camp that I can ride home in a day when I wish it. Land of our own. A forge of your own, proper this time, not a hill camp arrangement. I have coin saved from clan raids in better days, and you have a trade any settlement would welcome." She met his eyes, steady and certain. "I want a life built by the two of us, Ezekiel Mercer, not one borrowed from either of our peoples entirely, but something new, ours." It was, Ezekiel thought, exactly the kind of proposal he might have expected from a woman who had chased down truth across 3 provinces, rather than wait for someone else to clear her name, and he found he had no argument against it at all, only a swelling, warm certainty that this was precisely the future he wanted too. "I know a stretch of land," he said slowly. "About 2 days' ride from Draketin on the far side of the river. Good water, good grazing. Close enough to the border road for trade, but far enough from any lord's grasping hands. I looked at it once years back, before I knew I'd ever have anyone worth building a home for." "Show me," Beulah said, and there was something bright and eager in her voice that had nothing to do with land or trade routes and everything to do with the future they were choosing together. They rode out from the war camp a week later, with the chief's blessing and a small string of horses gifted by the clan as a parting kindness, and 2 days of easy travel brought them to the stretch of land Ezekiel remembered, a wide flat shelf above the river with good stands of timber for building and open grazing beyond, close enough to the border road that a farrier's forge would draw steady trade, far enough from any town's prying eyes that no magistrate's cart would come rattling up the path uninvited. They built through that whole spring and into summer, a proper cabin first, sturdy log walls raised with Ezekiel's carpentry and Beulah's considerable strength making short work of timber that would have taken a lone man months to move alone. And then the forge, set a careful distance from the cabin with its own stone chimney, and finally a paddock and a small barn for the horses that would, in time, become the foundation of a modest but honest trade. It was hard work, and it was, in its own way, dangerous work too, for the border country never entirely lost its wildness, and there were nights they stood watch together against wolves drawn by the scent of livestock, and one tense afternoon when a party of Vane's former soldiers, now masterless and turned to banditry after their lord's fall from favor, tested the new homestead's defenses and found, to their considerable regret, that an orc warrior and a farrier who had learned to fight beside her were not an easy mark. Beulah met the first bandit's charge with her sword, and a roar that sent 2 others fleeing outright, while Ezekiel, standing his ground at her side with a smith's hammer that had become, in his hands, a weapon every bit as fearsome as any blade, broke the arm of a man foolish enough to think a farrier would be the soft target in that fight. They buried no one that day, only sent the survivors limping back toward whatever ruin their former lord's disgrace had left them. And that evening, as Beulah tended a shallow cut along Ezekiel's forearm with the same careful hand she had once used to teach him clan words, she told him, quiet and certain, that she had never once regretted the day she rode her limping mare up to his forge in Draketin. "Nor have I," Ezekiel said, "regretted a single moment since." Autumn found the homestead finished and thriving, smoke curling steady from both the cabin's chimney and the forges, horses in the paddock, and a small but steady trickle of trade riding up the border road as word spread of a farrier who did honest, skilled work and an orc woman at his side who was, by every account that traveled with the trade, not to be trifled with, and not, in fact, any danger at all to travelers who came in peace. It was on a cold, clear night that first autumn, with the cabin warm around them and the work of the season finally settled into a rare quiet, that Ezekiel woke to the familiar low murmur of Beulah's sleep speech beside him, and this time, for the first time since that hollow beneath the black pines so many months before, he understood every word. She was not speaking of grief this time. She was not calling her brother's name into old sorrow. She murmured instead, half-formed and drowsy, a string of words that translated roughly to something like home, and safe, and his name, Ezekiel, folded in among the clan words like it had always belonged there. He lay very still in the dark, listening, his chest tight with a feeling too large for any single word in either language to hold, and when she stirred and woke, blinking at him in the low firelight, he could not help the smile that broke across his face. "What?" she asked, voice thick with sleep. "Are you smiling at, farrier?" "You," he said. "You talk in your sleep," she groaned, covering her face with one broad hand. "What did I say this time?" "You said home," he told her softly. "And safe. And my name, right there among your clan words, like it had always belonged." Beulah went still and then slowly lowered her hand to look at him, something soft and unguarded moving across her fierce, beautiful face. "It has," she said, "belonged there, since the day I heard your hammer twice and could not stay away." "I learned your whole language," Ezekiel said, "chasing the meaning of the words you would not say to me awake. And I would learn it all over again, every word, every year, if it meant understanding you a little better each time." "You already understand me better than anyone alive," Beulah said, and pulled him close. And outside their cabin the autumn wind moved through the pines with a sound like something singing. And inside, in the warm dark, Ezekiel Mercer held the fierce, magnificent woman who had chosen him, again and again, across danger and distance and every wall two proud peoples had built between them, and understood at last and completely that he was no longer the quiet man at the edge of any room. He was home. And so at long last was she. They lived on that homestead through many seasons after, the forge's ring carrying steady across the river valley. The cabin's chimney smoke a familiar sight to traders on the border road, and Beulah Grimtusk, fierce and magnificent as she had ever been, never once stopped speaking her clan tongue in her sleep. And Ezekiel Mercer never once stopped listening, grateful every single night for a language he had learned entirely for love, and for a woman who had chosen, out of all the world available to her, to build her whole fierce, guarded, beautiful heart around a farrier who had simply refused to let her go.